If you imagine all of the wiring of the brain going through those 6 layers, when there's a shift in those 6 layers, you can imagine what happens to the wiring.
Okay.
So it's not dissimilar from the utilities coming through the ground, through your base concrete in your foundation of your home,
Okay.
and up into the home. When there's an earthquake, that's where we see movement at different surfaces and a shearing of those structures. Well, when those wires that go through these 6 layers of cortex get sheared, we end up with problems. And it's not just wires, it's also vasculature that goes through these layers. So, when there's an initial blow to the head, those layers become destabilized. As those layers become destabilized, they need time to restabilize. If the individual has another blow before those layers become restabilized, that individual can be subjected to very severe brain injury or death. It's in some instances referred to as the second impact syndrome. And we've had lots of folks come in who were returned to play prematurely, who end up with severe brain injuries. And each year in this country, there are about 1.5 to 2 dozen students who die of second impact syndrome. So it's very, very significant. Now, the good news is most concussions are not going to result in long-term problems, at least that we know of today. What we believe happens is that within 30 to 90 days, 90% of individuals who have a concussion are going to be symptom-free.
Okay.
The real numbers are a little different. When we take a look at how many will have a symptom, one or more symptoms that persist for a year or longer, the numbers change. So individuals who will have one symptom that will last a year or longer, you'll see those individuals happening about 20% of all concussions. Individuals will have 5 or more symptoms that will last a year or longer. Now the number drops down to about 5%. So it's important to recognize that there's a severity curve in concussion. There are mild, moderate, and severe concussions, if you will, though that's not technical terminology.
Okay.
There's a concussion with a loss of consciousness. There's a concussion with amnesia, post-traumatic amnesia, and there's a concussion with neither. And what we know is that depending upon which of those you have, the concussion with neither is the least severe. The concussion with post-traumatic amnesia is the next most severe, and the concussion with a loss of consciousness is the most severe. Those happen in the least frequency. What we don't know, however, is whether a loss of consciousness connotes severity of injury. All traumatic brain injuries begin as concussions. So all a concussion is a change in the neurophysiology of how brain cells talk to brain cells. That's the beginning. Depending upon the amount of force that's applied, there may be stretching of the wires that connect them, or of the vasculature that connects them, or there may be tearing of those structures. Okay. If there's enough force, or if this brain is somehow predisposed to injury, the person is dehydrated, the person is too hot, the person is under a lot of stress, there's been a lot of force across these structures, there's a genetic predisposition in a particular brain, any or all of those can combine to result in a very unpredictable outcome. So we could take the same force, apply it in the same way to 10 people's brains and come up with 10 different outcomes that would be based upon those factors. There's no way to look in a patient's eyes and know if they've had a concussion. There's no way to examine a patient even 24 hours after an injury and know that they have or have not had a concussion. It's a sideline diagnosis, it's a circumstantial diagnosis, and it's a diagnosis that is made by combining what happened to the individual with the symptoms that they immediately showed and with their delayed symptoms. So when we image most people who have a concussion, we won't see anything.
Okay.
By definition, that means there's no focal neurologic findings on imaging. That means it's a concussion. If there are findings, like a bleed, now we're into a moderate to severe brain injury category. The scary part about these concussions, a patient who has second impact syndrome can walk into an emergency room and can talk with the treaters and make sense and can die, and there's nothing that the treaters can do to stop the death because there is this very severe shearing of structures throughout the brain. What we have to do is we have to make sure that we don't ever put a sporting event its importance in place of any student's furtherance of their lives, their academic careers, whatever lies ahead of them. There's no football game, there's no soccer game, there's no basketball game, hockey, there's no sporting contest whatsoever that's worth the loss of one's neurologic capabilities. That said, what we also have to recognize is what I said earlier. We think that when a person has a concussion and they recover, everything's done. We don't know that. In fact, when you take a look at the information coming out of the NFL players and the boxers and other professional athletes who've had repeated concussions, we now recognize that these brain injuries may actually be initiating and or accelerating neurologic disease. And those diseases are significant. They are diseases like Parkinson's. Take a look at Muhammad Ali. They are diseases like amyotrophic lateral sclerosis or Lou Gehrig's disease. It's now being questioned as to whether Lou Gehrig actually died of ALS or of complications, late complications, of traumatic brain injury. So when we think about things like multiple sclerosis, Huntington's chorea, Pick's disease, stroke, diabetes, Parkinsonism, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, a number of diseases, we're now beginning to conceptualize these diseases somewhat differently, and as though they may in fact have a proportion of these diseases that arise from previous trauma to the brain and changes in how the brain's neurophysiology functions that lead to the development of these diseases. So there's no such thing as a mild brain injury. Anybody who's had a brain injury would tell you that. Unfortunately, that's how we classify these, as mild traumatic brain injuries or concussions. Very serious stuff, very important that our coaches be trained, that our trainers be trained, that our physicians be trained. This is not an area that most physicians are well informed in. There's a lot of medicine to cover, and this is relatively new information. So our ER docs, our family docs, our pediatricians, our neurologists all need to have current training in what is in fact concussion, what is not concussion, and how it should be managed on a long-term basis. Further, we've got to have in place, and fortunately we do now have in place, structures that require that our coaches and our trainers and our team docs undertake a more comprehensive assessment of students with concussions. It's not the patients that we treated that matter. It's the patients that we didn't treat. It's all of the students out there who struggled through the symptoms of their concussion and tried to persist and put themselves or were put at risk. We know athletes who are injured have, they lie. Students who are injured lie, student athletes. They want to play. We have a society that says work through the pain, work through the difficulty. They're the last person to be asked as to whether they should return to the field. And fortunately, the laws that are in place now disallow their return to play if the concussion is recognized. So it's incumbent upon the adults, whether it's the parents in the stand, or whether it's the coach or the trainer or the school officials or the team doc, to make sure that if there's an event that could have been a concussion, that the player is removed from play. It's a safety matter more than anything else. The NFL has done more in the last 5 years, and the Iraq and Afghanistan wars have done more to raise the level of awareness in our country of traumatic brain injury than we have been able to do with the Brain Injury Association of America in 3 decades. So this is not well understood in general medical circles. If you line up 10 neurologists, you'll get 10 different ideas about what a concussion is and what it is not. And that's not to denigrate the neurologists in any way, shape, or form. It's just not been well studied and well articulated, except in highly specialized treatment centers. So it's understandable that we would not have responded properly to this problem. Today, however, we do understand it, and there really is not an excuse for a high school district or any other organized athletic event to denigrate traumatic brain injury and its possibilities from sports. Understand that there are between 1.6 and 3.2 million mild traumatic brain injuries from sporting events every year in this country. The lowest number, 1.6 million, eclipses the number of new diagnoses of cancer in this country on an annual basis. American Cancer Society says there's about 1.5 million new diagnoses of cancer every year. Just the mild traumatic brain injuries alone, at 1.6 to 3.2 million arising from sporting events, eclipses that number. You can add another 1.7 million traumatic brain injuries, another 700,000 strokes, and pretty soon you see that brain injury is a much more difficult and prevalent sort of major health phenomena in the U.S.